The origins of the space race trace back to the closing months of World War II as the United States and the Soviet Union closed in on Berlin. With victory in sight, their focus began to shift from winning the war to establishing themselves as world superpowers. The clash of these two ideologically opposed powers led to the defining conflict of the late 20th century, the Cold War. Because the countries feared the nuclear crisis that would ensue with open warfare, they competed to surpass each other technologically, most notably in the space race, the competition over space technology. It became a bitter ideological struggle to prove superiority of culture to the world. The space race's Cold War politics motivated the US to fight back from initial tragedy to triumphantly land men on the moon, reaching one of the most significant technological milestones in history. After witnessing the power of German V-2 rockets in World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became interested in rocketry for its potential use in delivering warheads in case of a nuclear war. While the Soviet Union opted to handpick its own Russian rocket scientists, the U.S. transferred Dr. Wernher von Braun, Germany's leading rocket engineer, to the U.S. Army in what was dubbed Operation Paperclip. His team began creating the Redstone ballistic missile based on the German V-2. During this time, in April of 1950, several of the world's leading scientists proposed an International Geophysical Year, a scientific effort to expand knowledge of the Earth. The official International Geophysical Year, or IGY, was set to coincide with a period of solar activity 7 years later. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to contribute to the IGY with a crowning scientific advancement. To ease the tensions of the Cold War, the IGY became an opportunity for the U.S. to show the non-military applications of rocket technology. As rivals, both the Army and the Navy proposed plans to the Eisenhower administration for the launch of an artificial satellite. While the Army wanted to adjust its current Redstone missile design, the Navy proposed to create an entirely new rocket program, Project Vanguard. In August 1955, President Eisenhower designated the task to the Navy. His reasons for doing so were clearly influenced by Cold War politics. He did not want to call attention to the ideological impurity associated with Wernher von Braun, a former Nazi. He did not want to undermine the peacefulness of the IGY by using the Army's Redstone ballistic missile. He did not want the satellite launch to distract von Braun from his top priority, developing a ballistic missile for the military. But this fateful decision would lead to tragic waste and inefficient use of resources. With Eisenhower's decision, von Braun and the Army continued to improve on their Redstone missile design while the Navy began creating the Vanguard rocket, starting from scratch and painstakingly reinventing much of this same technology. This highly wasteful and inefficient parallel engineering drastically slowed overall progress. This tragedy was a prime cause of many early failures, allowing the Soviet Union to take the lead in space technology. By 1956, von Braun and his team had bolstered the Redstone into the powerful Jupiter rocket. Even though it was fully capable of reaching orbit, von Braun was denied permission to launch it into space because Eisenhower preferred Vanguard for this task. He was instead forced to replace some of the fuel with sand to keep the rocket within the atmosphere so that it would not attract public attention. Eisenhower's political motives only served to hinder the program, but would change with the Soviets' first great achievement in space. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik. The Soviet Union's superior technological achievement sent a wave of fear through the American public. Many of the fears from the Red Scare in the early 50s were reawakened as the Soviets' communist system appeared to be leaving the U.S. behind. In response, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson magnified the importance of space technology by stating that, "Whoever controls space will control the world." While the government remained calm, Wernher von Braun was infuriated that his Jupiter had been denied permission to launch a satellite a year earlier. He said, "Failure to be the first in orbit is a national tragedy that has damaged American prestige around the globe." A month later, the Soviet Union launched the larger Sputnik 2, which carried the dog Laika. This second satellite further humiliated the Americans, who hadn't expected another Soviet achievement so soon. These consecutive Soviet successes started to change the president's priorities. Desperate to restore American dignity, Eisenhower poured funding into both von Braun's and the Navy's rocket programs, but this still continued the wasteful double efforts. On December 6, the Navy team was finally ready to launch the Vanguard rocket with a small satellite. Awaiting an American success, however belated, the entire nation witnessed the event with high expectations. They instead saw the immense 70-foot rocket break down and burst into flames after rising only a few feet. This embarrassing tragedy, dubbed Kaputnik, was just another reminder that the Soviet Union was ahead. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reveled in America's shame, calling Vanguard a cosmic boo-boo. Eisenhower turned to Wernher von Braun, who held America's last opportunity to retain any dignity. After 2 months, on January 31, 1958, von Braun's Jupiter rocket successfully launched the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1. Despite his Nazi background, Americans celebrated von Braun's accomplishment, for it established U.S. presence in the emerging space race. As the IGY ended, still facing the need to catch up with the Soviets, the U.S. government decided to unify its rocket programs under von Braun's leadership. That year, on July 29th, Eisenhower established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. By combining the Army's and Navy's separate programs, the agency was designed to solve the problems that had previously inhibited the U.S. This crucial unification was the first step that greatly increased productivity, fueling the space program. Even with the unity created by NASA, the U.S. nonetheless struggled through the space race, unable to catch up with their secretive opponent. Sergei Korolev, known to the world as the mysterious chief designer, was the mastermind behind the Soviets' achievements. His identity was left undisclosed to preserve the secrecy of their program. Between 1957 and 1965, the Soviets publicized a series of achievements, sending the first man and the first woman into space, completing the first spacewalk, and sending the first unmanned probe to the moon. However, deaths, explosions, and other failures always remained hidden from the public. The Soviets' secrecy shrouded their program, leaving the U.S. without a target to pass. The U.S. could not outdo the Soviet Union's barrage of achievements without goals of its own. In 1961, to solve this problem, President John F. Kennedy met with Wernher von Braun and other NASA officials to set a goal for the program, landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Establishing this long-term goal was essential towards an American victory because the space program needed time to organize itself and overtake its rival. By accomplishing such a remarkable feat, America's victory would go down in history.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
As the space program became a high priority, NASA's budget increased eightfold over the next 5 years. NASA completed 12 Gemini missions to prepare technology for Project Apollo. Von Braun began creating the Saturn V, a gigantic, powerful new rocket that a mission of such magnitude would require. As the space race's connections to the Cold War intensified, the nation unified behind Kennedy's goal. To the people, astronauts were heroic defenders of liberty fighting communism in space. The strengthening connection between Cold War politics and the space program put pressure on NASA to take more risks. Sometimes the effect was tragic, as seen in the Apollo 1 explosion that claimed the lives of 3 astronauts, but such tragedies only motivated the program further. In 1968, NASA received CIA reports of a gigantic Russian rocket that they believed to be part of the Soviet moon program. Fearing the crushing blow that a Soviet moon landing would have on the U.S. in the race, NASA took an enormous risk, modifying the Apollo 8 mission. Initially planned as a simple manned test of the Saturn V, it would now send the men into orbit around the moon, over 250 times farther than any man had ever traveled before. This huge risk, taken for the political opportunity it presented, turned into a great triumph as Apollo 8's success gave the U.S. its first lead in the race. After 7 months of precise coordination and exemplary teamwork, the U.S. landed men on the moon. On July 20, 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first 2 humans to ever set foot onto lunar soil, a quantum leap in human achievement.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Soviet Union, after facing many disasters of their own, never followed the U.S., effectively conceding that they could keep up no longer. This marked America's triumphant victory in the space race. However, after the race ended, space exploration, no longer propelled by Cold War conflict, lost importance in politics. NASA's funding was cut in half between 1966 and 76, showing how the space race had been the program's main fuel. Since Kennedy's speech in 1961, the moon landing had been the culminating goal of the United States space program. Despite initial tragic impediments, the program demonstrated resourcefulness and determination to fulfill Kennedy's vision of reaching the moon. Without the drive of Cold War politics, this major triumph in human exploration would not have been accomplished.